Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Michigan Authors Forum, jointly hosted by the Hatcher Library, where we're sitting now, and the Institute for the Humanities, of which I am the director, Daniel Hurwitz, and the Ann Arbor Book Fair. And also the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts has been involved as well. We are delighted tonight to be speaking with Professor Dr. Howard Markel, who will be speaking about his extraordinary book, An Anatomy of Addiction, Sigmund Freud, William Halsted, and the miracle drug cocaine. Just a couple of words by way of introducing the author. First, let me just say, because in my particular culture that I come from, you always begin talking about yourself under any circumstances, which is related to Freud, by the way. But in any case, it's called narcissism. In any case,
I have that.
I'm about to fly off to Venice after this particular occasion. I'm going immediately to the airport to take the waters, to find myself addicted to strawberries, no doubt, which is, of course, death in Venice and all of that, and to come back, I'm sure, with a raging case of tuberculosis, which is not unrelated to Professor Markel's wonderful first two books. The first of which was the award-winning Quarantine, East European Jewish Immigrants and the New York City Epidemics of 1892, which Johns Hopkins Press published in 1997, and then his completely marvelous When Germs Travel, 6 major epidemics that have invaded America since 1900 and the fears they have unleashed, which Pantheon did. Pantheon is also the publisher of The Anatomy of Addiction. I'm delighted to tell you that Barnes & Noble's bookstore, first of all, is still in existence, which in itself deserves a round of applause. And second of all, has the book back at the table, and so that it can be purchased afterwards and so forth. Professor Howard Markel is the George Wantz Distinguished Professor in the History of Medicine, Professor of Pediatrics and Communicable Diseases, Professor of History, Professor of Health Management and Policy, Professor of Psychiatry, and Director of the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Michigan. It reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon from the 1980s where there was a Latin American general standing with various kinds of stripes on in a military uniform, and it said, President of the Republic, Ministry of Health, President of etc. The versatility is extraordinary, and what it's telling you is that Professor Markel is not only a practicing clinician, but also a historian, a pediatrician, and indeed has worked for many years in a clinic with adolescents who have suffered from problems of addiction. And so that Dr. Markel is in a way a triple threat in the way that he approaches this extraordinary topic of two completely luminous figures in the history of medicine. Sigmund Freud, and William Halsted, who we're going to hear about in a second, both of whom were raging addicts, as a matter of fact, at one time in their life, if not continuously. And the point is, Dr. Markel approaches this not only from the point of view of a fantastic storyteller, he just, in elegant prose, really knows how to tell an extraordinary story. And putting these guys together is a work of genius. Secondly, he approaches from the point of view of a historian, a scholar, the archive, the history of medicine, and so, but also a clinician with an experience, if you will, of the seduction of wonder drugs, what it means to work in a clinical culture where, when new drugs, new techniques are discovered, people feel the sense of trying to use them widely to try and understand how far they can go and what they'll do. For example, when radiology, I guess, was first brought into being, I mean, used for everything, actually. And of course, what it produced was this raging set of disasters, actually. It sort of was radioactive and couldn't get through airport security anymore, something like that. Anyway, be that as it may, the fact of the matter is there are very few people who actually can combine a real clinical experience in a sense of the medical culture of research and the desire for cure, of the sense of new technologies and wonder drugs, and the real history of the archive, and a damn wonderful storyteller, which all combine to give us some story of Freud and Halsted. Let me just say before we start that Dr. Howard Markel is not just all of these things. He's consulted widely through the Center of the History of Medicine on pandemic influenza preparedness, planning for the United States Department of Defense, along with his associate director of the center, Professor Alexandra Stern. And from 2006 to the present, he serves as the principal historical consultant on pandemic preparedness, bird flu, etc., for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He's contributed over 200 articles to scholarly publications and popular periodicals, from New England Journal of Medicine to the Wall Street Journal. He's writing in the New York Times quite regularly. He has been on all manner of television programs, and I'm delighted to tell you that this very program is being taped by C-SPAN for its BookTV weekend show. And so please try and catch, if you want to watch it a second time, if you missed, for instance, the magnificent character of my introduction, and you want to watch it again, or whatever you want to look at, please,
I want to see how it turns out. So.
Please, cspan.org, and you can find it. Let's hope that it doesn't conflict with Michigan football, speaking of various kinds of cultural addictions, or at least forms of dependency. A couple of minor points. Please, if your cell phones are on, now is the time to change that. Secondly, when we get to questions, because after a brief conversation, we're going to open this up. There's a mic in the middle, so just please get yourself in line to just ask a question from the mic. That's an artifact of the fact this is being taped. And third, I do want to mention that Professor Markel was John Rich Professor at the Institute for the Humanities, where this book was originally conceived, and early drafts were produced in 2006. So, Professor Markel, let me just call you Howard now, okay, if I may. For those who aren't familiar, maybe especially with Halsted, tell us a little bit about the setup of these two addicts. What brought you to think about these two people and put them in one book?
Well, when I started, Danny, I wanted to write a cultural history of addiction. And you know, addiction is a rather new concept in medicine and medical history. The original meaning of the word, it comes from Roman law. And so what it meant in antiquity is that if I owed you a great deal of money and I could not pay you back, you would take me before a judge and he would make me your addict, your slave. And I was enslaved to you until I could pay restitution. Now, I love that. Now, the concept of being enslaved to something extraneous to you is really remarkable. But it wasn't really until the 1820s or 30s that doctors started thinking about addiction. The modern definition is that using a substance, but it can be a behavior as well, as we've been finding out recently, but using a substance not only with great and grave consequences, but a loss of control over that use, so that you know it's going to harm you and you still do it anyway. And that's different than substance abuse, where you can abuse it to harm, but it doesn't, you haven't lost that control. And morphine and opium really started the ball rolling with that. And doctors love to prescribe morphine and opium because it's an incredible painkiller. But nobody knew that they would be creating all these, as they call them, morphine eaters or opium eaters, or people with morphinism. And once the hypodermic syringe was invented, well, then the cow was out the barn door and even more addicts were produced. And so in the 1880s, there was interest in a brand new drug called cocaine hydrochloride. Now, coca leaves, had been used by aboriginals in South America for millennia. But finding out the way to chemically take those leaves and come out with a powder that is measurable, weighable, dispensable, prescribable, took quite some time. And that happened in 1884. And it was touted in all the medical journals of the day to all the great doctors as the miracle cure. It was going to cure everything. Tuberculosis, dyspepsia, flatulence, and even morphine addiction. And a young man named Sigmund Freud, who was not yet Sigmund Freud, even though that was his name, he was studying to become a neurologist in Vienna. He was working at the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, the Vienna General Hospital, which was the Parnassus of medicine at that time. That was the place in all the world. The greatest doctors, the greatest surgeons. Wasn't so great if you were a patient. It was more of a place where the diagnosis was key rather than the treatment, because we didn't have a lot of treatments back then. By the way, it's also the place where hand washing was first discovered to be an important issue, something that doctors still are working on learning. But Freud became very interested in that. And he did so not only because he thought